You think American country folks survived on just cornbread and beans? Think again. These rural homesteads served up some of the most resourceful, nose-to-tail, and surprisingly sophisticated meals in American history. Let's dig into 25 forgotten countryside dinners that kept entire communities fed, warm, and connected through the harshest winters and the Great Depression itself. Pinto beans with ham hock. Walk into any rural kitchen from the 1920s through the 1960s, and you'd smell pinto beans simmering before you even opened the door. Across Appalachia and the rural South, farmers grew their own beans, dried them in burlap sacks, and stored them through brutal winters. When hog killing time came in late fall, the ham hocks became the secret weapon for transforming dried beans into something transcendent. You'd soak dried pintos overnight, then simmer them with a smoked ham hock for 4 to 6 hours on a wood stove. That ham hock would slowly surrender its smoky, salty, fatty essence, turning plain beans rich and meaty. The collagen would break down, creating a thick, silky texture that coated every bean. This was poor folk food that fed entire families for days, stretching across dinner, next day's lunch, and even breakfast if you fried the beans in lard. Potato soup. Before cream of anything came in cans, country families made potato soup that could warm you from the inside out during February freezes when the root cellar was running low. This dish emerged from German and Irish immigrant communities across the Midwest and Appalachia, bringing potato-centric traditions to American soil. During the Great Depression, this soup fed families who'd lost everything. You'd start by rendering salt pork or thick-cut, home-cured bacon in a heavy pot. Add diced onions and potatoes, cut into irregular chunks with skins on. Then cover with milk or water and simmer until the potatoes broke down. Some cooks would mash a few potato pieces against the pot side, stirring them back in to create body. The texture was chunky and substantial, with pieces ranging from firm to completely dissolved. The rendered pork fat would float on top in little orange pools, adding richness to every spoonful. Collard greens with pot liquor. In the rural South, collard greens weren't a side dish. They were a nutritional powerhouse that grew when everything else died and could feed families through the darkest winter months. From the Carolinas through Georgia and Mississippi, collards represented African-American culinary genius meeting Southern agricultural reality. Country families planted collards in late summer, knowing they'd still be harvesting when snow covered the ground. You'd harvest massive leaves, wash them obsessively, slice them into thick ribbons, then simmer them with smoked ham hock or fatback for 2 to 4 hours. The greens would break down, absorbing the smoky, salty, fatty essence of the pork. The cooking liquid, the pot liquor, would turn jade green and become more valuable than the greens themselves. This vitamin-rich broth could revive the sick and provide nutrition when food was scarce. Smothered pork chops. When country families slaughtered a hog, the pork chops became the foundation for one of the most satisfying dinners in rural cooking. These weren't pristine supermarket chops. These were bone-in, thick-cut slabs from backyard hogs with actual fat marbling and rich flavor. You'd season the chops with salt and pepper, dredge them through flour, then brown them in lard until golden. Remove the chops, add sliced onions to the drippings, then sprinkle in flour to create a roux. Slowly add water or milk, scraping up caramelized bits until thick gravy formed. Nestle the brown chops back into the skillet, spoon gravy over top, cover tight, and braise for 45 minutes to an hour. The result was fork-tender pork, swimming in onion gravy, so rich it demanded white rice or mashed potatoes. The gravy stretched expensive meat to feed more mouths. Sow belly and black-eyed peas. In the rural South, sow belly, unsmoked, uncured pork belly, represented the most economical cut of the pig, and paired with black-eyed peas, it sustained sharecroppers and tenant farmers through hard times. Black-eyed peas came to America with enslaved Africans, proving hardy enough to grow in the poorest soil. Sow belly was pure pork fat, with maybe a thin streak of meat, salted heavily for preservation. You'd cut the sow belly into chunks and render it slowly in a heavy pot. Add soaked black-eyed peas, cover with water, and simmer for 2 to 3 hours. The peas would absorb the pork fat, turning creamy inside while holding their shape. This was New Year's Day food across the South, eaten for luck and prosperity. But for many families, it was Tuesday night dinner. The peas represented coins, and eating them meant financial security in the coming year. Braised beef short ribs. Country butchers practically gave away short ribs because city folks didn't know what to do with them. But country cooks understood that connective tissue and bone marrow meant flavor, and time meant tenderness. You'd season the ribs heavily with salt and pepper, then sear them in a Dutch oven until deeply browned. Remove the ribs, sauté onions, carrots, and celery in the beef fat. Then add vinegar or canned tomatoes. Return the ribs to the pot, add liquid to come halfway up the meat, cover tight, and forget about it for 3 to 4 hours in a low oven. The tough collagen would melt into gelatin. The fat would render and baste the meat from within, and the bones would give up their marrow. When you opened that pot, the meat fell off the bone, and the gravy was dark and glossy. This was Sunday dinner after church or when the preacher visited. Biscuit pudding. When morning biscuits went stale, country cooks transformed them into biscuit pudding, proving poverty cooking could be utterly delicious. Across Appalachia and the rural South, biscuits were made fresh every morning. Real buttermilk biscuits from flour, lard, and buttermilk. By evening, they'd be hard as rocks. You'd tear those stale biscuits into chunks, lay them in a buttered baking dish, then whisk together eggs, milk, sugar, vanilla, and cinnamon. Some cooks added raisins or preserved fruit from summer canning. Pour the custard over the biscuit chunks. Let them soak for 30 minutes, then bake until golden brown. The biscuits would maintain some structure, creating pockets of tender, pudding-like texture, alternating with crispy edges. During the Depression, this turned yesterday's breakfast into today's treat. Nothing went to waste, and the result tasted like something you'd make on purpose. Cornmeal mush. Before oatmeal became the breakfast standard, cornmeal mush fed millions of rural Americans every morning. Corn was cheap, sometimes free if you grew it yourself, and took it to the local mill for grinding. You'd bring water to a boil, slowly whisk in coarse ground cornmeal, stirring constantly to prevent lumps, then simmer for 15 to 20 minutes until thick and creamy. For breakfast, you'd serve it hot with butter melting on top, sorghum molasses or honey, and milk poured around the edges. It stuck to your ribs through a morning of hard farm labor. But here's where country ingenuity shined. Leftover mush would firm up when cold. The next morning, you'd slice that solidified mush into slabs, dredge them in flour, and fry them in bacon grease until crispy and golden. These fried mush cakes became a completely different food. Crunchy outside, creamy inside. Country ham with red-eye gravy. In the rural South, country ham with red-eye gravy represented breakfast cooking elevated to art form. Country ham meant salt-cured aged pork that hung in smokehouses for months, developing concentrated pork flavor so intense it almost hurt. Families would butcher hogs in late fall, coat the hams in salt, sugar, and pepper, then hang them over smoldering hickory. You'd slice the cured ham thick, cook it in a hot cast-iron skillet with no added fat, then remove the ham and pour strong black coffee directly into the hot pan. The coffee would hit the drippings, causing violent sizzling as it deglazed the pan, lifting all those caramelized bits. The mixture would turn reddish-brown, hence red-eye gravy. The coffee's bitterness balanced the ham's saltiness, creating a thin but intensely flavored gravy. You'd pour this over split biscuits, letting them soak up every drop. Liver and onions. When families butchered livestock, liver came free with the animal, and country cooks turned this nutrient-dense organ meat into weeknight dinner. Liver provided more iron and vitamins than expensive muscle meat. You'd slice the liver thin, cutting away tough vessels, then soak the slices in milk for at least an hour to draw out the metallic taste and bitter compounds. While the liver soaked, you'd slowly cook sliced onions in bacon grease until they caramelized and turned sweet. Drain the liver, pat it dry, dredge each slice in seasoned flour, then cook fast over high heat, maybe 2 minutes per side. Overcook liver, and it turned into shoe leather. Cook it right, and it stayed tender with a slight pink center. The crispy coating and sweet onions made it palatable. Women would serve liver once a week, insisting it built strong blood and healthy children. Venison stew. When hunting season opened, successful hunts meant venison stew that would feed families through winter weeks. Deer were plentiful, and a single buck could yield 50 to 75 pounds of free meat. You'd cut venison shoulder or neck into rough chunks, brown them hard in bacon grease in a Dutch oven, then add rough chopped onions, carrots, and celery from the root cellar. Some cooks added turnips, parsnips, or rutabagas. Cover with water or stock, add canned tomatoes, then season with salt, pepper, bay leaves, and a splash of vinegar to cut the gamey taste. Let that stew simmer for 3 to 5 hours on the back of a wood stove. The long cooking would break down tough connective tissue and create thick, rich gravy. The venison would transform from tough and chewy into tender chunks that fell apart at the touch of a fork. Fried green tomatoes with grits. When early frost threatened to kill the last tomatoes of the season, country cooks picked every green tomato on the vine and turned them into something crispy and savory. At season's end, tomato plants would be loaded with green fruit that would never ripen before frost killed the vines. You'd slice those green tomatoes thick, dredge them through flour, dip in beaten eggs mixed with buttermilk, then press firmly into coarse ground cornmeal. Fry in a half-inch of lard or bacon grease until golden brown and crispy, about 3 to 4 minutes per side. The coating would turn crunchy, while the tomato inside softened slightly, but maintained its firm texture and tart flavor. Serve the fried green tomatoes on a bed of stone ground grits cooked low and slow for 45 minutes, finished with butter. The crispy, tart tomatoes contrasted beautifully with the creamy, mild grits. Brunswick stew. In the rural South, Brunswick stew meant big pots bubbling at community gatherings, church suppers, and family reunions. A thick, tomato-based stew that started with small game meat and ended up thick enough to eat with a fork. Original versions used squirrel, rabbit, or wild game, but most cooks switched to chicken or pork. You'd simmer meat until it fell apart, pull out the bones, shred the meat, then return it to the pot with canned tomatoes, corn cut from the cob, lima beans, onions, and potatoes. Some added okra or hot peppers. The key was using more vegetables than seemed reasonable, because they'd cook down and thicken the stew. Add ketchup or barbecue sauce for sweetness, Worcestershire sauce for umami, then simmer for hours until thick enough that a spoon stood up in it. This was community food, always made in huge batches because neighbors would show up. Hoppin' John. On New Year's Day across the South, Hoppin' John brought luck and prosperity to every table that served it. This rice and field pea dish combined West African cooking traditions with Southern ingredients, creating something uniquely American. You'd start by cooking bacon or salt pork until crispy, then remove it and sauté diced onions, celery, and bell pepper in the rendered fat until soft. Add dried field peas or black-eyed peas that had been soaked overnight. Cover with water or stock and simmer until tender. Once the peas were nearly done, stir in long grain rice, the crispy pork pieces, salt, pepper, and a dried red pepper for heat. Cover tight and let everything steam together until the rice absorbed all the liquid and turned fluffy. The peas represented coins, the greens served alongside represented paper money, and eating both on New Year's Day meant financial security all year. Chicken bog along the South Carolina Lowcountry and coastal areas. Chicken bog fed crowds at church socials, family reunions, and community fundraisers. Despite the unappetizing name, this one-pot dish of chicken, rice, and sausage became comfort food worth craving. You'd simmer a whole chicken in water until the meat fell off the bone. Then pull out the bones and shred the meat. In that flavorful chicken stock, you'd cook sliced smoked sausage, diced onions, and long-grain rice, letting everything absorb the rich broth. The rice would become creamy and slightly sticky, almost risotto-like but simpler. Season with salt, lots of black pepper, and maybe some hot sauce. The dish got its name because the rice would bog down in the pot, becoming thick and porridge-like. This was economical cooking that stretched one chicken to feed 20 people, bulked up with inexpensive rice and sausage. Hog maw. Hog maw, the stomach of a pig, represented the ultimate nose-to-tail cooking, turning what others discarded into a meal that tasted surprisingly delicious. Pennsylvania Dutch communities and Southern cooks both claimed this dish, stuffing the cleaned stomach with sausage, potatoes, onions, and seasonings. Cleaning the stomach was the hardest part, requiring thorough scrubbing and sometimes soaking in salt water. Once cleaned, you'd fill it with a mixture of loose pork sausage, diced potatoes, chopped onions, salt, pepper, and sometimes cabbage or sauerkraut. Sew up the opening with kitchen string, place it in a roasting pan with water, and bake low and slow for 3 to 4 hours. The stomach would turn tender and slightly crispy on the outside, while the filling cooked into a flavorful, moist stuffing. Slice it thick and serve with sauerkraut and applesauce. This was food that proved nothing went to waste. Ham and bean soup. When the holiday ham was eaten down to the bone, country cooks made ham and bean soup that somehow tasted better than the original meal. That ham bone still held meat in the crevices, plus all the concentrated flavor from the curing and smoking. You'd put that bone in your biggest pot, cover it with water, add dried navy beans or Great Northern beans that had been soaked overnight. Then let everything simmer for hours. As the soup cooked, you'd add diced carrots, celery, onions, and maybe some potatoes. The beans would gradually soften, and some would break down, creating a thick, creamy broth. The last bits of ham would fall off the bone, and you'd fish out the bone before serving. Season with salt, pepper, and bay leaves. This soup tasted like resourcefulness and comfort combined, making something from what seemed like nothing. Neck bones and rice pork neck bones were the cheapest cut at the butcher shop, full of tiny bits of meat clinging to vertebrae. But slow cooked in a pot with rice, they created a meal that tasted rich and satisfying. You'd brown those neck bones in a heavy pot with a little oil, developing color and flavor, then add diced onions, bell peppers, and celery. Pour in water or stock to cover, add bay leaves, black pepper, and let everything simmer for at least 2 hours until the meat was tender enough to fall off the bones. Remove the bones, pick off any meat, then return the meat to the pot. Add long-grain rice, cover, and let it steam until fluffy. The rice would absorb all that porky, flavorful broth, turning creamy and rich. This was soul food that stretched pennies into dinner, proving that patient cooking could transform scraps into something delicious enough to crave. Country fried steak. Country fried steak turned the toughest, cheapest beef into something tender, crispy, and smothered in creamy gravy. You'd start with cube steak, bottom round that had been pounded with a meat tenderizer until flattened and covered in tiny indentations. Season it aggressively with salt and pepper. Dredge it through seasoned flour. Dip it in beaten eggs mixed with buttermilk. Then dredge through flour again for a thick coating. Fry in a cast iron skillet with hot lard or vegetable shortening until deeply golden brown and crispy on both sides. Remove the steaks, then make gravy right in the same pan with the drippings, adding flour, milk, salt, and plenty of black pepper. The result was crispy, tender steak covered in thick, peppery white gravy that you'd serve over mashed potatoes. This was working-class food that turned cheap into crave-worthy through technique alone. Oxtail stew. Oxtails, the tail vertebrae of cattle, required hours of cooking to become tender. But the result was a stew so rich and flavorful, it tasted like liquid gold. Country cooks knew that bones and connective tissue meant depth of flavor and silky texture. You'd brown the oxtails in a heavy pot until deeply caramelized. Then add rough chopped onions, carrots, celery, and garlic. Pour in red wine if you had it, or just water or stock. Then add canned tomatoes, bay leaves, thyme, salt, and pepper. Cover tight and braise in a low oven for 3 to 4 hours until the meat fell off the bones. The collagen would melt into the braising liquid, creating a gravy so thick and glossy it coated the back of a spoon. The meat would be spoon-tender and deeply beefy. This was special occasion food that proved cheap cuts, treated with respect, could rival anything expensive. Chitterlings, chitlins. Chitterlings, the small intestines of a pig, represented the ultimate in making do with what you had, turning the least desirable part of the animal into a dish that became beloved soul food. Cleaning chitlins was the most labor-intensive process in country cooking, requiring hours of turning them inside out, scrubbing away any remaining debris, and rinsing repeatedly. Once cleaned, you'd boil them in water with onions, garlic, bay leaves, and vinegar for 3 to 4 hours until tender. Some cooks would then bread and fry them until crispy. Others served them in their cooking broth. The smell during cooking was notorious, strong and barnyard-like, but the final dish had devoted fans who grew up eating them at family gatherings and holidays. This was food that proved nothing went to waste, and that dignity existed in making the least desirable cuts delicious. Hominy with ham. Hominy, dried corn kernels treated with lye to remove the tough outer hull, became tender, almost creamy, and took on flavors beautifully when cooked with ham and seasonings. You'd start with dried hominy, soaking it overnight, then simmering it for hours until the kernels softened and puffed up. In a separate pot, you'd cook diced ham or ham hock until the meat was tender. Then add the cooked hominy to the ham and its cooking liquid. Season with salt, black pepper, maybe some butter if you had it, and let everything simmer together until the flavors melded. The hominy would absorb the ham's smoky, salty essence, turning from bland to delicious. This was stick-to-your-ribs food that filled you up and kept you warm through cold weather. The dish represented the Native American and Southern fusion that defined so much country cooking, combining indigenous corn preparation with European pork preservation. Fried rabbit with biscuits. When men returned from hunting with rabbits, country women fried them up with the same technique they used for chicken, creating crispy, tender meat that rivaled any store-bought protein. Rabbit was free food, plentiful in fields and woods, and one rabbit could feed a family of 6. You'd butcher the rabbit into pieces, back legs, front legs, saddle cut into sections, then soak the meat in salted water or buttermilk for a few hours to remove any gamey taste. Pat the pieces dry, season with salt and pepper, dredge through seasoned flour, then fry in hot lard or vegetable shortening until golden brown and cooked through. Rabbit meat was lean, so you had to be careful not to overcook it, but done right it was tender and mild. Serve with hot biscuits to soak up the pan drippings and gravy made from the leftover frying oil and flour. Beef tongue stew. Beef tongue might sound unappetizing today, but country cooks knew it was tender, flavorful meat that just required proper preparation. You'd start by simmering the whole tongue in water with onions, bay leaves, and peppercorns for 3 to 4 hours until tender. Once cooked, you'd peel away the thick outer skin while the tongue was still warm. It came off easily. Cut the peeled tongue into chunks, then use it like any other stew meat. Brown the chunks in a pot. Add onions, carrots, potatoes, and celery. Cover with stock, and simmer until everything was tender. The tongue meat was more tender than regular beef, with a unique texture that was almost creamy. This was nose-to-tail eating that got every penny's worth from the butchered animal. The tongue itself cost almost nothing, but yielded several pounds of usable meat. Wild turkey and gravy. Before factory farm turkeys became standard, country men hunted wild turkeys that tasted completely different, leaner, more flavorful, and gamier than anything you'd buy today. A successful turkey hunt meant a feast that could feed the entire family. Wild turkey required careful cooking because the meat was lean and could dry out easily. You'd roast it low and slow, basting frequently with butter or bacon fat. Then use the drippings to make rich gravy. Some cooks would braise wild turkey instead, cutting it into pieces and simmering it with vegetables and stock until tender. The dark meat was deeply flavorful, tasting like the acorns and wild food the turkey had eaten. The breast meat, properly cooked, was tender, but with more character than domestic turkey. This was special occasion food, served at Thanksgiving or Sunday dinner, representing both skill and luck. Squirrel stew. In rural America, squirrels were plentiful, and country boys learned to hunt them young, bringing home free protein for their mothers to cook. Squirrel meat was dark, rich, and slightly gamey, requiring long cooking to become tender. You'd cut the dressed squirrels into pieces, brown them in a heavy pot with bacon grease, then add onions, carrots, potatoes, and any other vegetables from the garden. Cover with water or stock, season with salt, pepper, bay leaves, and maybe some thyme. Then simmer for 2 to 3 hours until the meat fell off the small bones. The resulting stew was rich and hearty, tasting like wild game but milder than venison. Kids would carefully pick around the tiny bones, getting every scrap of meat. This was poverty food that didn't taste poor, proving that patient cooking and wild game could create meals just as good as expensive cuts. Hamburger gravy over mashed potatoes. When the paycheck ran thin and the cupboard looked bare, this dish saved countless families from going hungry. Grandma would brown a pound of ground beef in her trusty skillet, letting the fat render out to create the base for a rich, creamy gravy. She'd sprinkle in flour, whisking it into the beef drippings until it formed a golden paste. Then came the magic. Milk poured slowly while she stirred, creating a gravy that could feed 6 people with just 1 pound of meat. The secret was in the seasoning. Salt, pepper, and a dash of garlic powder transformed simple ingredients into comfort food that stuck to your ribs. Ladled over a mountain of mashed potatoes, this meal could silence even the hungriest teenager. The gravy would seep into every crevice of the potatoes, creating a harmony of flavors that made even the toughest times bearable. It was filling, affordable, and most importantly, it made everyone feel loved. Shipwreck casserole. The name might sound strange, but this casserole was anything but a wreck. Created during times when every ingredient mattered, it combined ground beef, noodles, and crushed potato chips into a dish that was both economical and satisfying. The potato chips weren't just a garnish. They were an essential ingredient that added crunch and flavor to every bite. Ground beef formed the protein base, seasoned simply with salt and pepper. Egg noodles provided substance and helped stretch the meat to feed more people. But the real genius was in the topping. Crushed potato chips mixed with a bit of butter and baked until golden. This created a textural contrast that made each forkful interesting. The casserole was assembled in layers, with the beef mixture on the bottom and the chip topping creating a crispy crown. It was the kind of dish that made children excited about dinner, even on the toughest days. Beef jambalaya bake. Southern comfort met practical cooking in this hearty casserole that brought the flavors of Louisiana to kitchen tables across America. Unlike traditional jambalaya that required constant stirring and attention, this baked version was perfect for busy mothers who needed to feed their families without spending hours in the kitchen. The foundation was ground beef, browned until it developed those rich, caramelized edges that would flavor the entire dish. Rice joined the party, along with diced tomatoes and whatever vegetables were available. Onions, bell peppers, and celery, if you were lucky. The magic happened in the oven, where all the ingredients melded together into a cohesive, flavorful meal. Each grain of rice absorbed the beef juices and tomato flavors, creating a dish that was both exotic and comforting. It was filling enough to satisfy the hungriest family members and economical enough to make regularly, even when money was tight. Hamburger spoon bread casserole. Cornmeal was a staple in Depression-era pantries, and clever cooks found ways to transform it into satisfying meals. This casserole combined the comfort of spoon bread with the heartiness of seasoned ground beef, creating a dish that was both filling and surprisingly elegant. The ground beef layer was seasoned with onions and simple spices, creating a savory base that would support the cornmeal topping. But this wasn't just any cornmeal mixture. It was enriched with eggs and milk, creating a custard-like consistency that baked into something resembling a cross between cornbread and pudding. The result was a dish with contrasting textures that kept every bite interesting. The beef provided protein and flavor, while the spoon bread topping added substance and comfort. It was the kind of meal that made a house feel like a home, filling the kitchen with aromas that promised satisfaction and warmth. Chia hot dish. Long before chia seeds became a superfood trend, this hot dish was feeding families across the Midwest with simple, affordable ingredients. The name might be confusing to modern cooks, but this was pure comfort food that combined ground beef, vegetables, and whatever starches were available into a satisfying one-dish meal. Ground beef formed the protein base, browned until it developed those flavorful edges that would season the entire dish. Vegetables like onions, carrots, and potatoes were added, along with whatever else was growing in the garden or available at the market. The mixture was seasoned simply with salt, pepper, and herbs, then baked until everything was tender and the flavors had melded together. It was the kind of dish that could be adapted to whatever ingredients were on hand, making it perfect for times when flexibility was essential. Each serving was hearty enough to fuel a day of hard work, yet economical enough to make regularly.